Welcome to my presentation on Indigenous languages, identifying the motivation of revitalization. Ani Bojo Paula Dijnakas, Atikmekshing Dunjaba. Hello, my name is Paula and I'm from Atikmekshing. I wanted to introduce myself in my language. I'm from the Ojibwe Nation and Ojibwe is my language. I consider this as my first language. I am familiar and I can speak some words, but I'm not fluent. For this assignment, I am focusing on language revitalization, second language acquisition, and motivation, specifically with Indigenous languages in Canada. The research that I have completed and still completing is categorizing in 4 sections. The state of Indigenous languages in Canada, so looking at some of the numbers, some of the what's happening with Indigenous languages in Canada today, reasons why Indigenous languages are important and to revive and learn, motivations and barriers of reviving Indigenous languages. So talking with people, finding reasons why languages are not being learned or why there is a decline in language. And looking at positive actions for the future of learning and reviving Indigenous languages. So looking at the supports and actions that are needed to sustain a language. So the state of Indigenous languages. In 1990 and 1991, the Assembly of First Nations, AFN, conducted a survey in the state of First Nations languages on Canadian First Nations. The results were published in 2 reports, Towards Linguistic Justice for First Nations, 1990, and Towards Rebirth of First Nations Languages in 1992. Out of 630 First Nations in Canada, 110 First Nations were surveyed. And one result that came out that was very telling was that it showed that out of roughly 53 languages in Canada, 50 were becoming extinct. So in over 1/4 of the communities, the language was declining, meaning that there was a decrease in the number of speakers in each age group. Important to note that the ages 55 and over were where most of the speakers were at. So this survey was 20 years ago. So at this point in time, these speakers are more than likely not with us at anymore. Although this survey is 20 years old, it still does paint a picture of how Indigenous languages in Canada are declining and to this day are endangered as ever. And we do need drastic actions to make sure that languages are sustaining and revitalized. Some of the reasons for revitalization. Learning Indigenous language connects to your history and identity as an Indigenous person. Elders, knowledge keepers, and community members speak about this all the time. The language is who you are and it connects you to your identity. We must learn the language. Indigenous people speak about how language is the culture and there is no separation. The loss of the language contributes to the loss of culture in Indigenous people. Once a language is gone, connections are gone, meanings are gone, uh, resources are gone within us. The whole society are gone once a language is gone. So we need to ensure that languages are learned and that our young people are learning the language. Language learning gives young people confidence and pride. So when young people learn a language and they're proud of who they are and they're able to speak another language, it has been shown that this creates pride and identity within young people, and therefore learning another language becomes easier and better for them to learn. There is a great connection to the land in the language. It is said that the Indigenous people are caretakers of the land, and as the languages are spoken, they keep the language as the center. The land as the center, and everything relates to the land and how it works. So the language describes the land, describes how things work in the land, how we relate to the land and the people work together. The reality of Indigenous language use. Assimilation, colonization of Indigenous populations did serious damage to the spiritual, cultural, and emotional lives of Indigenous populations. So this assimilation and colonization affected the language loss. Government, mainstream societies wanted the land, they wanted economic and political gain, and by having no Indigenous populations, they are able to achieve this easier. So with that, language gone, culture is gone, and but this did not happen. Indigenous peoples have survived, and now we are looking at reviving our languages. Genocide, forced relocation, and cultural and society systems brought on by contact with the white society are a cause of language loss. In an article by Teresa McCarty called Revitalizing Indigenous Languages in Homogenizing Time, she discusses this assimilation and colonization and how it does contribute to the language loss. James Crawford, in his article, Endangered and Native American Languages, What is to be Done, he discusses that the residential and boarding schools, English-only rules were in fact one of the greatest cause for language loss. Native American children in Canada and the United States were sent to residential boarding schools to learn English, to be part of mainstream society. They were taken from homes and taken from their communities to learn this way of life. So their language, their culture was disregarded and shown that it was not needed anymore or important for these children's lives in their lives. So with that historical significance, we have some barriers to language learning. I interviewed 3 women. 2 do not know the language, and 1 grew up, who is an elder, grew up in the language, but at this time do not speak it. I found that they are aware of societal and historical importance of language, but they are not learning the language. So I want to look at some of the reasons why they didn't learn the language. And it came to show that barriers are very personal, some are community-wide, and societal pressures do not allow for Indigenous to feel confident and keep and learn the language. So some of the discussion that came up was that language is not a priority in my life right now. So there are other priorities, and learning Indigenous language is not one of them. I'm scared, and it is not something I don't know. So fear, I get along in life without knowing my language. English is the way of the world, and many people speak English, so to get along in English is what is needed. Our community doesn't value it in our governance, in our programming, in our meetings with our youth and elders. So other people don't support it or value it, so it's not going to be important. And the elder discussed that a good reason for me not learning the language is because I do not have no one to help me to say it right or the meaning of words. When I was growing up, I could hear words and ask what it meant, and I was young and able to remember. So there are actually no speakers to speak to each other and to continue to speak the language and to help others learn the language. So motivations to learn a second language. R.C. Gardner wrote an article or had some research on motivation and second language acquisition. He writes about 2 motivation types, language learning motivation and classroom motivation. These motivations are present in the home, learning environment, and educational systems. Indigenous language have varied level commitment, and the motivation is strained by barriers developed over time. So there are 2 types of motivation. One is to learn a language because you want to, and because you want to learn a culture, you want to communicate with a different culture. And another motivation is in the classroom, so you're actually getting marks for it. You're getting results from learning a language. And all these are present within the home with parent use, community use, and society use, and in the educational systems. But with Indigenous language, there are varied levels of this commitment and varied levels of these motivations, and they're strained by these barriers that I discussed earlier about assimilation, colonization, residential schools, and various other historical activities that happened. So part of the future and positive actions for the future. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was a commission that went across Canada to talk about residential schools. They released findings in 2016. The TRC has 94 recommendations to address issues that relate to the colonization, to relate residential school, the issues of language loss, the issues of culture loss, issues of self-esteem, and mental health of Indigenous people. Those recommendations need to be addressed and put within programming, government, educational systems so that all community, all Canada knows what needs to be done to serve for Indigenous people. Youth and the children need to learn the language, and support and encouragement to learn language of government, local leadership and community and local schools and parents need to be secured for language to survive. So looking forward in my research, I want to interview a fluent speaker, a speaker who learned to be fluent, and an Indigenous use, all to further explore the motivations behind language acquisition. I want to look at successful immersion programs, and I want to look at how community and society needs to be aware of implications of the loss of a language. So thank you for listening. Miigwech, and we'll talk again soon.